knows precisely when tapa came to the Pacific, but it was almost certainly brought by travellers. Along with their gods and customs, they brought the mulberry tree, the source of their cloth and paper. Originally from Southeast Asia, the plant and bark cloth manufacturing first took hold in the islands north of Australia before spreading the length and breadth of the Great Ocean.
The earliest tapa making that we know of in the Pacific is in Indonesia. There are very old traditions in Indonesia, and then into New Guinea, and there are probably old traditions of tapa making in New Guinea that we don't really know very much about. We just see the scattered remains of them in New Guinea tapa.
From the northern coast of New Guinea, the ancestors of the Polynesians, the Lapita people, colonised the Pacific, taking the mulberry with them. And finding it would not seed in the new lands, they took care in the plant's propagation, so that eventually tapa making was practiced from Hawaii in the north to the Marquesas in the east and Aotearoa in the south.
In different areas of the Pacific, I think climate and soils have had a pretty strong determining effect. So tapa making is pretty much restricted to the high islands, the ones with volcanic soils, or the high coral islands. It's not found on the coral atolls.
Though its names were various, everywhere it could be grown, bark cloth became a central part of life. The ancient craft developed almost infinite variety and refinement, moving beyond the utilitarian to incorporate spiritual, social and artistic functions.
In New Guinea especially, there are very diverse traditions, and in that area it seems to be related much more to religion and ritual. Quite often a lot of these special tapa cloths were actually made by men to be used in ritual. And then further out into the Pacific, it still retained a very strong connection with religion, but it also came in much more relating to class differences, to hierarchy. So you get the chiefs allowed to wear tapa but not the commoners, or you have the commoners making tapa for the chiefs, those connections like that. Tapa was also used to actually make figures of the gods and to wrap the gods, but it also had a lot more utilitarian uses in Polynesia especially, so it was used as clothing and other purposes too.
The popular term tapa is Samoan, describing the unadorned edges of the cloth. In Hawaii, it's called kapa. In Tongan, Ngatu. In Fiji, masi. The Māori called it ote. Few are aware, but tapa was made here in New Zealand, the mulberry having been brought on the Great Migration. These mulberry beaters found at a 16th century Waikato Pass site are some of the oldest found anywhere, but the cloth itself has not survived.
By the time that Europeans arrived in the Pacific, the only Maori tapa that was being made were little thin rolls that were put through the perforated earlobe and actually worn as an ornament. That was the only use of it. But the traditions are very strong that it was used originally for lots of other things, maybe clothing in the early days before flax clothing developed, but certainly for other things, for making kites, for wrappings, all sorts of ritual uses that we probably don't know anything about. But the actual tapa cloth has disappeared now, so all we have left is the evidence in Maori tapa beaters.
Throughout much of the Pacific, the art of tapa making died with the introduction of Western technologies. In some islands, however, it survived, taking on new forms and functions. In this program, we explore the art as it is practiced in Tonga and Samoa, and touch on the tapa revival in New Zealand. In every plantation amidst the food crops, the taro, the coconut and cassava, mulberry trees are planted for use in tapa making. The cuttings are planted in rows with enough space between so they can be easily tended as the straight stems grow rapidly skyward. It is the straightness that makes the mulberry so valued, and the growers help this by daily tending the plants, breaking off any shoots that grow from the main stem.
Break it off. That's young one. It's still okay. If you leave it too late, it will branch out like this, and it will not go straight as like this.
Well cared for ote have the shoots removed before they develop into branches. But a small green branch can still be snapped and left to die off. Once a branch becomes woody, however, it will leave a scar in the bark, a blemish that will lessen the quality of the finished product and make the work of the tapa maker more difficult.
Okay, on this plantation, you can see that the coloring of the hiapo is starting to change from this color to a more white pale color. This is the color that indicates that the plantation is ready to be harvested.
Plants are harvested 2 to 4 years after planting. Older plants will yield a coarser bark and will be more suitable for the underlayer of the tapa cloth. Younger, finer bark will provide the top layer, and the trees are sorted and packed up according to their size before being taken to be stripped. In its original home in East Asia, the mulberry bears seed, but here in the Pacific it has to be propagated from cuttings. Once a tree is harvested, it will send out lateral roots from which seedlings will grow, and it is these that the growers remove for the new planting. In every Tongan village, the rhythm of daily life is beaten out by the sounds of women processing the harvested mulberry. The drumming of their work floats on the breeze. Preparing the bark cloth is a back-breaking process whereby the bark of the mulberry is removed and beaten into fine cloth. With their teeth, the women gash the bark so they can pull it from the wood, taking care to keep the bark in one piece. It is the inner layer of bark that the women seek. Using a shell or even a knife, a cut is made as a starting point from where the inner layer or tutu is carefully separated from the husk. The tutu are left in the sun to dry before being sorted according to size. If a large tapa cloth is to be made, hundreds may be paired, then matched with other pairs to make a takainga tutu or tekau, a roll of 20 tutu of similar dimensions. The tutu can be stored for several months before being beaten with a mallet of ironwood called a ike. The tool has 4 sides, 3 of them grooved to help break up the fibres of the tutu. The 4th smooth surface is used to flatten the tutu. The tutu are soaked overnight to help soften the fibres before beating. Traditionally, this was done by tying the tutu to rocks and submerging them in the sea or streams. The beating or whakapā is done on a tutua, a hard wood log that rests upon sticks and coconut husks, which act as shock absorbers and reduce the noise that accompanies the beating. First one, then the second of the pair of tutu is processed, using water to maintain its softness. Soon a 2-inch wide strip becomes 4 and then 6 inches. Now the Ngatu maker is ready to transform her tutu into cloth. She matches a pair, carefully aligning the edges, then beats layer upon layer, still using the groove side of the yike. At last she beats with the smooth side before the edge of the folded tutu is cut to produce a cloth of uniform width. As it is opened up, it receives a final pounding with the smooth side of the yike. The completed length of cloth, the wheta'ake, is now hung to dry.
This one piece has come out of the pair, have been matched and beaten together and become a one piece. Almost 2 feet wide piece of ngatu or wheta'ake has been produced from a 2-inch tutu.
The small scars in the bark of the mulberry tree now appear as holes in the wheta'ake. The tiniest blemish in the tutu has become a major flaw, which will now have to be repaired if the tapa is to have any value. Once the cloth is dry, the women painstakingly go through and patch these using small offcuts, which they glue onto the underside of the wheta'ake, using a native starchy potato known as mahua'a koka'anga. This same potato is used to glue several wheta'ake together, both width and lengthwise, to produce a single piece. This piece of cloth made from te kao or 10 pairs of tutu will soon be joined to others in the next stage of the process. In many parts of the Pacific, plain unadorned cloth was once worn as clothing. This cape from New Guinea could also serve as a bed cover, while these poncho from the eastern Pacific were often uncoloured. In some cultures, patterns were beaten into undyed cloth. This waistband from Vanuatu is an example of plain cloth that has been carefully beaten upon a stencil to produce intricate indentations. Coloured, patterned bark cloth is standard throughout the Pacific region. Its variety is almost endless. The coconut palm is the icon of the Pacific, ever present on the landscape. For the people of the Pacific, it is a key resource, a ready supply of drinking fluid, a fuel, and an integral ingredient in the vast array of island cuisine. In Tonga, the coconut is also a central element in the making of tapa. The stencils or kubesi that are used to print designs on the bark cloth are made entirely from the coconut. Kaka, the fibre that grows at the base of the branches, is collected and joined together to form the kubesi. The spines of coconut leaves are shaped to form the patterns, and these are bound to the kubesi using stringy fibres taken from the husk of coconut itself. Several kubesi are then bound with strips of wheta'ake to the large board called a papa koka'anga, on which the next stage of the process will occur. In every Tongan village, small sheds and halls are used by koka'anga, work parties of women who print the wheta'ake. Usually 12 women make up a koka'anga, each bringing wheta'ake they have processed to contribute to one or more large tapa. The women seat themselves on both sides of the papa with its kubesi attached. Frequently, the papa also has matting, wire or fishing nets to provide a more interesting texture to the printed cloth. The women stretch lengths of wheta'ake lengthwise along the papa board, joining them together using the partly cooked root of the tapioca plant as a glue.
You can see that
The cloth is then rubbed with a sponge soaked in dye, so the patterns from the stencils are clearly visible. This is the bottom or laulalo layer, and once rubbed it's liberally smeared with glue so that a second layer can be attached, this time by joining wheta'aki strips at right angles to the first layer, thereby adding strength to the completed cloth. This layer too is rubbed with dye. Some kokoanga use modern materials in this process, reducing some of the arduous preparatory work. This group are spreading a paste of flour and water on the bottom layer of the cloth, which is made from calico. In all other aspects, however, their operation is traditional. Wheta'aki is used for the top layer, and once a section is complete, it is rolled and passed across the papa to rest in the laps of the senior women, before a new section is added, glued and rubbed with dye. The most senior women sit at the ends of the papa. They supervise the process, ensuring that each piece of wheta'aki is laid straight and smoothed out before glue and dye are applied, thereby keeping their designs consistent and symmetrical through the entire tapa. The leaders also hand paint dividing lines and numbers on the edge of the tapa, which indicate a unit of measure or langanga. The making of a single tapa may require several hours of sitting, but it is nevertheless a time of considerable enjoyment and important to the cohesion of the village. Along with the chatter and singing, the older women pass on skills and knowledge to a new generation. The completed tapa is now set to dry in the sun. This length of 50 langanga is not unusually large, since it will be later divided among the women. Lengths of tapa are often double the length seen here. Close inspection of the cloth shows that the designs from the kupesi have taken well, and that the care taken in aligning the two layers of rubbed cloth have resulted in fine detail. The dyes and colours of bark cloth vary throughout the Pacific according to the availability of materials. Almost all dyes are manufactured from plants or earth. The ochre deposits available in New Guinea and Hawaii provide red and yellow dyes. For most of the region, however, soil offers only brown pigments, which are always mixed with plant dyes. Where available, the turmeric root offers a yellow colouring, though it fades considerably with time. This rich red dye from Samoa is manufactured from the introduced loa tree, while the blue in this cloth from the Solomon Islands comes from indigo. Only brown and black dyes are used in Tonga Ngatu. These women are using a dye from tonga or mangrove trees, which they have mixed with the sap of this tuitui or candlenut tree. The kernels of the tuitui fruit are also useful. When burned, they produce a rich, shiny black oil that was once used as tattooing ink in parts of the Pacific. In tapa making, it is used occasionally to dye highly prized black ngatu, but its more frequent use is for hand painting already dyed tapa. The most common source of dye in Tonga is the koka, a tree common in the Pacific. The outer bark is first scraped off so that the reddish-brown inner bark can be collected, usually in large quantities. Provided the wood is undamaged, the remaining trunk will regenerate and be ready for further harvesting in a few years. The red bark is thoroughly soaked with water and mixed into a pulp before it is transferred into a fao, a long bag woven from the tough fibres of the fao tree.
But you see that this is the plant. where you get the young straight ones and tear them, dry them, and use it to weave the basket. Yeah. Very strong fiber. I don't think anyone in the world can break this. We're pulling it. This Tongan rope.
With its load of coca bark pulp, the whao is bound together and then hung from a tree for squeezing. Once a ngatu has been thoroughly sun-dried and flattened under a mattress for 1 or more nights, it is hand-painted. Often hand-painting involves highlighting existing design using a darker dye. Some ngatu are hand-painted freehand. This group of women are heavily overpainting their ngatu using the black dye of burned tuitui kernels, which they apply using a sharpened key of a pandanus fruit. The pandanus plant grows throughout much of the Pacific and is sometimes used in the making of stencils. Designs in Tongan ngatu vary from traditional to more contemporary. This ngatu includes a number of older motifs whose meanings are variously interpreted. This manulua pattern may derive from birds in flight and looks similar to a Samoan pattern which is said to represent birds. The hair pattern is said by some to represent the main islands of Tonga, while this whata pattern dates from the first line of Tongan kings, the Tui Tonga. Symbols pertaining to the life of the current royal family are common in modern ngatu. This ngatu includes the lion, a reference to Tupou I, the 3 stars of the kingdom, and the halapaini, a design representing the pine trees which grow along the front of the royal palace. Though it's seldom used as clothing anymore, tapa remains a vital feature of Tongan life. When it is worn, it is on special occasions. Ngatu is the cloth used in this wedding dress and may also be seen in clothing at other ceremonies. Mostly, however, ngatu is a prized heirloom and an important symbol of a woman's wealth and standing. It is also much gifted, passed from one person to another as a token of respect. At this funeral, mourners present the family of the deceased with fine mats and ngatu as a mark of their esteem for the dead. At funerals such as this, where a person of social standing is mourned, hundreds of ngatu may be gifted. The production of bark cloth, or Siapo in Samoa, follows much the same process as in Tonga. Tradition states that the mulberry or ua arrived on the island of Savaii from Fiji and soon became an important crop throughout the entire island group. Usually it is harvested after 10 to 14 months growth. The bark is stripped and the outer husk removed to reveal the inner layer, which is also called the ua. The ua is soaked. Like several other Pacific peoples, Samoans scrape the ua, a process they call vavalu. This is done to remove imperfections and to help soften and spread the fibres. 3 different shells are used for scraping, each with a specific function. One helps break the fibres and begin to spread them. The second straightens the broken fibres, while the final shell is used to remove water and waste. In earlier times, the vavalu was done by women while they sat in a stream. Cold, uncomfortable work, which nevertheless resulted in fine white siapo of exceptional softness. Today's method is still critical and the process is lengthy, involving repeated washing and folding. A 2-inch wide ua is gradually turned into a cloth 3 times that width. It is only now that the ua is beaten using an iea against a tutua, both of which are made from Samoan hardwoods. The iea or beater has 2 grooved sides and 2 which are smooth. Beating in Samoa is done quite slowly and carefully and without great force. It is done to a definite sequence and rhythm that results in a cloth of even width. Working always from the centre, the beater further spreads the fibres using the grooved surface of the iea and then flattens the cloth with the smooth surface. Nowadays, 2 or 3 pieces of ua may be beaten at one time, whereas in the old days, when larger quantities were required, 10 or 12 ua may have been beaten and then set out to dry. Once the ua is dried, it is ready for the application of dye and design. Traditionally, this was done by the rubbing method over stencils or upeti. Leaf upeti were used up until the 1930s. Women constructed them from the leaves of the pandanus plant and the midrib needles of the coconut palm, making quite intricate designs. These designs on the Siapo-clad walls of Robert Louis Stevenson's home are all from the rubbed leaf upeti. The introduction of metal tools led to the replacement of the leaf upeti. Designs began to be carved directly onto wooden boards, and men who had previously been largely excluded from Siapo making now became the pattern designers. The upeti board is gently rubbed with dye using a swab or tata before the ua is placed onto it. Then the ua is gently rubbed to flatten it against the upeti and achieve an even covering of dye. Traditionally, all Samoan cloth was brown, with variations of shade and gloss. The oa tree remains the major source of brown dye. It is the same tree as the Tongan koka and is harvested in the same way, by scraping the bark and squeezing it using a woven fau. The tonga or mangrove and the candlenut tree, here called lama, also provide brown dye. In some areas of Samoa, a brown ochre called ele is scraped and dusted onto the ua to provide a redder tinge. It is only used in this way and is never used as a wet dye in painting. Once the first layer of ua has been rubbed, it is readied for patching. Arrowroot or masua is rubbed over the holes before the patches are applied. Though it looks simple, patching requires skill to prevent flaws in the finished siapo. Masua is now applied to the ua before a second layer is placed on the upeti. The siapo maker rubs the new ua against her face to find which is the roughest side, and this is placed against the first layer with the grain running at right angles to the first. It too is rubbed with the dye and with the ele. The completed cloth is removed from the upeti and once dry can be highlighted through hand painting. The key of the pandanus fruit is used as a brush, and a variety of dyes may be used. Traditionally, only brown or black were used, but today the women make dyes of other colours. A yellow is made from the root of the turmeric, and a red from the pods of the loa tree, sometimes called the lipstick plant. A violet colour is achieved by grinding the seeds of the pomoli tree. A purple dye, langavase, can also be made from the sap of a banana plant. The leaves of this green ground-covering plant were traditionally used as a painkiller on the gums of teething infants. When ground and squeezed, they produce a dark green dye. Siapo tasina, that is siapo produced by the rubbing or ele method, was the most common form of siapo in traditional Samoa. More usually, it was not highlighted at all because it was produced in such large quantities as a fundamental item in daily life.
They used it for clothing, and they used it for diapers for a newborn babe. They used it for a sheet or a blanket, and they used it also as dividers, because the Samoan fale in those days was open. And for privacy for families to separate at night, they used to divide into sections and put up a curtain for privacy. And then they used it for ceremonial purposes after they decorated. And then for death, they used it as a shroud to wrap the body in for burial.
Marilyn lives here on the beach at Waitongi on the island of Tutuila. It is the place where her mother, Mary Pritchard, is buried, and where she worked for many years reviving the art of Siapo making, which threatened to die out completely in the third quarter of the 20th century. Much of the interest in Siapo, both here in Samoa and internationally, can be attributed to the work of Mary Pritchard and her children, Marilyn and Adeline. Both daughters are particular exponents of Siapo mamanu, the freehand method of Siapo design, which Mary learned in the village of Leone in the 1920s.
My grandfather lived over there and had a store there, and we used to go over for weekends. So Mama and Dad used to take me, and then she'd always wander off to see the women in the village and see what they're doing. And she ran into them working on their tapas. So she said, I want to learn how. So the women said, oh, come on in. So they gave her materials. They showed her what to do, and she went to it. That's how she learned, was with the women of Leone. And then she went home and she worked on her own, and then she'd come with her finished up to show them, you know, the designers over in Leone. And she just went on from there. Hers, she stuck strictly to the design, to the symbols, but she became more intricate in the utilizing of those symbols. And she used a lot of the fine lines to give it more intricacy.
Traditional Samoan Siapo used 13 symbols, all of them derived from the environment, which may be grouped or sized in any combination. The wha'aopenga originally represented the large net used to snare pigeons or turtles. It is commonly used on Siapo upeti and in Siapo mamanu as a filler of space. These small lines, or tusili, are said to derive from common household items. The wavy lines, for instance, represent senate, while the straighter lines are from the coconut midribs. The wha'aleao, a triangular shape, comes from the tropis shell, a traditional source of food. This shape is often modified into a diamond also. The pandanus bloom, or wha'asinango, with its cluster of sharp points, is another symbol, while the wha'alaupaongo, the pandanus leaf, also features strongly. The wha'alaulu, the breadfruit leaf, appears to date from the early years of the 20th century, when it became popular in Siapo mamanu. Bird symbols take a number of forms, and birds in flight are often mistaken for flower motifs. A popular space filler are the footprints of the sandpiper. The starfish, or wha'aweao, has often been mistaken for a sun symbol, and may vary from artist to artist. The banana pod, wha'atumua, was probably first used in Siapo mamanu and is not found on older leaf upeti, while wha'amasina, which seems to refer to the moon, is usually attributed to a roll of dried pandanus leaves. Other traditional symbols are wha'anuwhe, the worm, and the wha'atualoa, or centipede, popular in Old Siapo. The origin and meaning of the longolongo symbol is unknown. Designs change over time. Early wooden upeti designs were similar to the leaf upeti, using a small number of motifs in a simple fashion. Later, designs became quite geometric and complex, but maintained the traditional motifs, and some new symbols emerged. On these boards, one can identify playing card symbols and the use of words. Traditional Siapo makers like Marilyn and Adeline Pritchard spurred modern Western influence motifs. They find the variations they can create using the traditional motifs are endless. Adeline, whose works are internationally sought after, often builds Siapo mamanu around one or two motifs used in complex variation. As tapa making undergoes a revival in its traditional home, interest is burgeoning on new shores. These young New Zealand children, a generation away from their Polynesian homelands, are making their own form of tapa, and in the process finding new meaning and affirmation in the familiar.
It's at home. Now they go home, they go to church, they wear them, they go to the shopping centre, it's everywhere. So what I did with the children, I said, well, go home, look around inside your household, and see if you have any Pacific Island art.
And this one comes from?
And they went home, and it's amazing, all that work that they brought home. Oh, I found this on my mum's necklace. I saw this on my dad's lava lava.
In Samoan we call it?
In class, the children learn the meaning of the common symbols in tapa, inspiring them to look anew at art in their own environments.
There was a special bird called the sandpiper's bird.
The children created their own designs, drawing on the traditional patterns, and then transferred these to lino tiles, their equivalent of the Samoan upeti boards they had seen in pictures. The teachers had been anxious to imitate the process of real tapa making. Here the rubbing of paper over this lino upeti is done with a crayon, bringing out the patterns in much the same fashion. At this stage, the paper does not have the texture of siapo. The children try to imitate the feel and look of the real material by scrunching the paper, a process which is quite effective.
This is very important, you don't put dye on
The application of a dark dye using a paintbrush now provides a real tapa look. The children are encouraged to apply the dye evenly and sparingly, and then it is left to dry before the final highlighting. Highlighting is done with old felt tip pens dipped in a black dye. It brings the children's patterns to the fore, revealing strong images of pandanus birds' feet and banana pod. Across town in a very different classroom, these older children are following a different process, one that more closely imitates the Siapo mamanu method. The children have begun by looking at traditional tapa and have then been asked to develop their own designs based on nature. Through careful observation, they sketch, isolating elements that they will later develop into motifs. These symbols become the building blocks for an overall plan for a finished tapa design. The design is mapped out on the paper and then colour is added. The children work with only two colours, black, which is applied with felt tip pen, and a brown dye, which is painted on. The fact that some children have chosen to work in a cooperative way reduces the time involved in this. It is now that the scrunching of the paper takes place. This is done for a long time and with energy, so that the fibres of the paper are broken and it becomes soft to the touch. A well-scrunched paper will actually reduce in size and have the look of beaten mulberry. The children have decided to give texture and depth to their work by the addition of stencil designs. These stencils on cardboard are rolled with ink and then applied to the original work. The interest in tapa as an art form is not confined to New Zealand classrooms. A number of New Zealand painters are deeply influenced by the tradition. This is The Sun, a work by Niuean New Zealander John Pule. For John, Niuean Hiapo helped him connect with his family homeland.
I was so used to looking at European art and listening to all the things that is fantastic and dynamic about European concepts, that I actually got tired of it. And so I deliberately started looking around, and then I came upon Niuean Hiapo.
What he found in the photographs and museum collections were vibrant representations of experience.
We're talking about the 1880s here, when they were painting these incredible patterns and motifs, and at the same time filling them with large amounts of text, talking about different members of their families, talking about different pieces of land that were important to each member of their family. And they were giving dates, they were quoting exact copies from the Bible.
To John, the Hiapo are maps of personal journeys, filled with landmarks and topography, both temporal and spiritual.
When you look at Niuean Hiapo, a lot of it's in grids, and a lot of it is repetitive kind of motifs and images, and a lot of forest symbols are in it. And there's also a lot of marine life as well, like sharks and fish. And there's also paintings of colonial figures.
Though the symbols and the words are his own, Pule's paintings are following the same narrative path. This early work honours his family and their Niuean roots and marks his own birth there. 9 years on, his painting The Sun speaks of the family's journey to a new home in New Zealand. It is a painting about displacement and dreams of home. John Pule's journey in tapa mimics that of the Lapita people. Tapa records their pilgrimage to the Pacific. The art of tapa depicts landmarks and milestones, and it serves to define what makes a people and what is significant to them. The story of tapa is the story of journeys. It is about migration, about the changing relationships between people and land, and between people and their forebears. Mostly, though, it is about personal journeys, which form the identity of Pacific people in their particular place and time. The contemporary art of tapa making that we captured in Tonga and Samoa is the tapa of the present. The journey of tapa in the future will be as varied and divergent as it has been in the past.